All right, well, since there are no adults in the room, let me go ahead and address the question of why there are shitty questions from the press. Now, first, I would like to say that a lot of the press, at least, well, some of the press actually do this job as a full-time position, meaning that they aren't a freelancer. Or if they are a freelancer, they actually do this as, a full-time freelance job, right? And sure, they've put themselves in this predicament, so that's why I don't say that you should show them, any sympathy in that regard, because they ultimately had a choice to go into this industry. As with any creative industry, in fact, it's always a choice to go into that rather than you being forced to, right? It's one of the, I guess, perks of being in a creative industry. But with that said, this is sometimes people's livelihood, meaning that oftentimes what they'll do is instead of having quality, sometimes that slips for quantity. That means that in order to make the bills or whatnot, they have to do more and more different interviews in order to kind of supplement their income necessarily. So this is why you might see some filler type content or some shitty news pieces or whatnot, etc. It's just because it's just a way to pay the bills. So, and it's not like anyone wants to do the filler news and to reiterate what some other fucking website has said before. And so you just cover the same story and maybe you add, your little bit of opinion or whatnot. So that's, I think, part of the reason as to why we get shitty questions within interviews. And so this all started because, of course, recently there was a Cloud9 interview to where a press person had asked, kind of a shitty question. Let's be fair, but it wasn't that horrible. In fact, it just depends on maybe your mindset where you're coming from, whether that be from the interviewer or the interviewee. Kind of takes two to tango, but we'll get into that in a second. But funny thing is, I was actually going to participate in the finals press conference for both the losers and the winners interview, but I just ended up being fucking sick from the shot or whatever. So, sucks ass. But I would have liked to bring some entertainment value. But anyways, so another part of this aspect of why there are shitty questions is because there are just amateur press. And now I'm not going to go on my high horse and say that I am not an amateur because I think under 5 years, if you're an interviewer, I say you kind of somewhat are an amateur. Like, yeah, sure. If you're 3 years in, like I am, I think I'm 3 years in. Am I? Yeah. 4 years. If you're 4 years in, it's like, yeah, you should kind of know what to do right and what to do wrong. But overall, you haven't mastered your craft. You haven't done anywhere near that. You still have room to grow, etc. You do things, you fuck up more than a master would. So, there's that aspect. But yeah, there are a lot of amateur press. There's a lot of churn, right? So it's not like you get the same interviewers that can then build up their skill set and whatnot. So yeah, I think that is part of the problem, is that there are just multiple different amateurs and it's different names all the time. Most of the time, people just see the same press outlets and they just think, oh, it's Invent Global, or, oh, it's Upcomer or whatever. And they don't realize that it's a different author every single time. And it might be an entirely fresh and green author, right? And also, if you actually look at some of these amateur interviewers and you read their one-on-one interviews, they actually aren't that bad. Some of them ask some decent questions. And so there's the big difference there, is that the one-on-ones don't equate to necessarily the quality of what would be a press conference and, that type of interview style. They're two completely different things in two completely different modes, one of which you get to practice quite often, the other of which you only get to practice every finals or every, quarterfinals or whatnot. So there's a very big difference between the two. Additionally, there is also the problem of press asking two closed-ended questions into open-ended questions. And by that, I mean I could ask something of like, how did you think that this match went? And then that's it. I could ask that entirely. And that may be a good question for maybe a caster, right? Because a caster is very experienced in talking, in open-ended talking points, and kind of they can angle whatever that you give them, and they could grab on to whatever that you give them. But maybe you might need to add some specific things to make it a little bit more closed-ended. And on top of that, I think there is a stigma with what is called begging the question, in terms of to where you ask certain hypotheticals within that question as to maybe what you're thinking of, and like people think that that's like, okay, like that's what you want them to think. It's like, no, you're just leading them into a direction to where they feel more comfortable in answering the question, and it's in more of a zone to where they can actually answer the question, right? Versus something like, how do you think that game went? That's very broad, or very, I guess, like galaxy brain type shit, to where they could just answer in a multitude of styles. Like, this is like the famous problem with a lot of open world RPGs, is that there's just too many options to where you don't actually complete the game. I'm sure a lot of you guys have not completed Morrowind, or Skyrim, in fact. Morrowind, I say that's old school as fuck. You haven't completed Skyrim, right? So there are these aspects, and with that said, you have to be able to read your interview subject to know if you can ask a more open-ended question, or if you can ask a more closed-ended question. And the better of, I think, both of the two to bridge that gap is you ask multiple questions within that particular question. For instance, I could say something like, oh, okay, tactical, oftentimes you end up playing Ziggs, and I wonder if, is this because you guys want to do a lot of wave clear bot in terms of that, and getting pressure onto the bot lane turret, and you trying to get turret plates? Or is that because you want Core JJ to roam, and then you help Alfari in the top lane? Like what is your entire game plan when it comes to, I guess, the team composition when it comes to Ziggs, right? And so there was a whole bunch of different aspects of which he could actually answer. One, which was of which lane pressure, bot lane, cool. One other, which was Core JJ being able to roam, Alfari, etc., right? And unlocking him in the broader scope of things. Or is it team composition, helping the broader team, etc., right? There's like a multitude of areas, right? So that's generally how I will present a question, because I think that's just more beneficial, because it allows for different access points, but specific access points for them to then say maybe what they want to say. And oftentimes I will develop that question to where I feel like I know one of their answers, but I will give them multiple different options to kind of go along that different puzzle, to where maybe they could turn into a different thing that I didn't think of before, which was, the whole wave clear type bot lane. Like, I don't think that is actually a solution of what they actually want to do, but I leave that as, a question that maybe he could answer, to say yes, actually, or no. And sometimes too, I'll even say, or am I just completely wrong in all of these aspects? Like, just let me know your thoughts on the entire situation, as far as like the Ziggs pick. And I'll leave the question off with that, but I will point him in, all these different multitudes of maybe what I'm thinking about the game itself. So that's I think personally, that's the best style to develop a question, is you have both the closed end and the open end, and you let them decide, and they can answer any form of that question that I pose, because it was like 4 or 5 questions all in itself, right? And I don't think a lot of amateur press, actually, I don't think a lot of press do that in and of itself. Just even more experienced press, I don't think they do that. So one thing that I noticed in this entire conversation was Travis Gafford had suggested that there be some kind of progression system for press, right? It was like, you could build your way up from academy, and then, you could kind of go from there and, get to the LCS and start doing LCS interviews, or maybe even LCS press conference interviews and whatnot. And, I don't think he was saying that this should be like the hard stop limitation or whatnot, or Riot should enforce this or whatever, because Riot generally, they do just hand out press badges like candy. Anyone can get a press badge. And I think from what I was hearing was that the voting for, all pro or for MVP was very limited. They actually didn't hand it out to everyone. Funny enough, I actually didn't submit my MVP or any of that just because I forgot. I got a fucking real time day job, so like I just, too much shit was going on. But I don't disagree with the Spica MVP. I probably would have voted for him, I think. Anyways, but so with this said, of the progression system and whatnot, I think this is the job of the editors, is it not? Right? To make sure that interviewers improve. And that's not to say that Travis Gafford was insinuating that this is the job of Riot or whatever. Like, no, it's not. I don't think he would agree that it is either. But it should be that maybe these press organizations, what they do is they start you out, to do some academy interviews or whatnot. And then you kind of work your way up. The editor is going to be like writing your fucking, or rather you're going to be writing their coattails and figuring out exactly how the interview style of what you're doing and how you want to develop your own style. The editor can then kind of facilitate that a little bit, show you the proper way, and then you can kind of go on your own and do your own shit as, you get into the LCS press and whatnot. So I think one of the most shocking things that I've ever heard when I've interviewed LCS players is when they say, no one has ever asked me these types of questions in the way that you've asked them, and or rather maybe like, this is the best interview that I've ever done. When I hear that from players, which I like, I'm not trying to toot my own horn or anything, but when I've heard this, and it's on rare occasion, so like let's be fair, it's not like, I'm the fucking messiah or some shit, but when I do hear this, it surprises me first because I'm not like, their first 5 interviews or whatever. Like, I'm like the 10th or something, or the 15th or 20th or whatever. And so they've had like plenty of time to do these interviews and whatnot. And I think it's because a lot of these guys, they try and go for the same general questions because, well, first, they've never actually interviewed that player, right? So you're doing the interview for your specific outlet, and maybe your outlet doesn't have the origin story or something of this particular brand new player, right? And so maybe you want to get the origin story for your website, even though every other fucking website has done the origin story of how did you go through Challenger and how did you go through Amateur and then you make it to the LCS or whatever the fuck, right? So maybe you want that, especially for the SEO, right? Because websites, if you guys don't know, it's called search engine optimization. So maybe you want that search engine optimization to then do that interview of the origin story so that you have it on there, and maybe you can get hits from Google, right? So maybe you do that in that aspect. I've never actually tried to do, which is why I don't do the fucking generic questions. It's always I'm trying to think outside the box or, whatever the fuck. But with that said, that ends up wearing out the players because they end up hearing the same shit over and over again, the same fucking questions, and they get tired of it, right? And it's just like they don't want to do the 5th interview of how they got introduced to video games when they were younger, like no one wants to hear that. So with that said, the reason why press conferences fucking suck ass is because, well, they're quickly done after the match, meaning it's actually very difficult for the interviewer to either first like come up with their questions, which to be fair, they should have already done before the match had ended or before even the series starts. And also, it's because it's difficult to rework your questions because you don't know who's actually going to win. And sure, you can develop winner and loser questions for each team beforehand or before the match or whatever. But a large part of that too, of a loser's questions, is going to be dependent upon maybe why they lost, or just the circumstances surrounding that. So it's going to be more difficult to develop your questions ahead of time, especially for the losers, right? And then also, it's difficult to frame your questions based on a loss versus a win, right? It's obviously more difficult to frame your question for a loss because you want to be sensitive towards the player that just lost, right? And like, they're already pissed off. They already kind of don't want to do the interview. So, you have to frame it in such a way to where they're more willing to respond to your questions as such, rather than, a winner's interview. They're excited, they're happy, etc. You could basically fucking ask them anything. So on top of that, problem with press interviews is that someone may have already asked your question. And so since someone asked your question, you're just like, fuck, like, now what do I say, right? And this might actually be a symptom of what I was talking about before, of people trying to get on the record maybe a question that had already been asked, and so they have to get it for their outlet, and so they kind of generally ask the same fucking question, which is a big problem. It's a problem in traditional sports too. But I think this goes back into the livelihood of just like, well, I need to ask this question because my editors need this, and so therefore I need to ask something, no matter how stupid or obvious it may be. I need to ask it. And if you're going into a press conference to where you need to ask a question, even though it's kind of shitty, or someone asked something pretty similar, you already know that it's a bad question, or that it's a wrong thing. So why ask it? And it might come down to money or to eating, for that week or whatnot. But like, maybe you shouldn't be a full-time interviewer or reporter if you can't think outside the box when it comes to this type of shit. Maybe you should have prepared multiple different questions, of which maybe other people might not ask that particular player. Like I said, I was going to do the finals press conference for both the losers and the winners, and I developed questions for both teams, but I was just too sick in order to go into the press conferences. But after hearing how shitty the lower bracket was, I was just like, well, let me bring in some really good questions to make this shit, poppin' or whatnot. Because at the end of the day, what I realize about these press conferences is I do think there's a lot of unoriginality given, even sites copy breaking news without their own sources. They just say, sources from this other journalist had said that, this shit is happening, and so apparently this shit is happening, right? Like recently Iceland broke, right? And so I assume other outlets are going to say, oh yeah, Iceland is confirmed per, upcomer or some shit. And it's like, okay, so you guys didn't confirm your own sources? Like, this is how esports or even regular news journalistic websites go down under, is because if that person failed on their sources, you fail also too on their sources. So why would you ever do that? That's the stupidest fucking irresponsible thing of a journalistic website. It just makes no sense. Get your own fucking sources, dude. It doesn't make any sense at all. So with that said, I want to harken back to a press conference that I actually did participate in, which was in spring with Cloud9. And I had asked a question to Blabber and Perks, talking about how they play. It seems like they play more and more aggressive as they progress in a best of 5. And why is that the case? And both InVen Global and Law Esports used the player quotes from my question. And it's like, so why is it that these journalists can't come up with unique questions like that? And by the way, if you guys had noticed that question, it was sort of begging the question, right? Because I had posed the idea that both Perks and Blabber are aggressive in best of 5s. I kind of said that as a premise. May have been true, may have not been true. I think that it is true, but And I think most people would say that it's true, which is why I said it. But that is still setting up the question or begging the question. But also, too, I think it's a little bit more acceptable in press conferences to beg the question, because press conferences, it's not there to receive in-depth characterizations or personalities of said player. It's more to add entertainment to the entire package of what is the match, or what was the match, in fact. And so you can beg the question a little bit in post like press conferences, which I don't think a lot of other interviewers necessarily think of when it comes to, the traditional begging the question, right? And that it's all bad all the time, never do it or whatnot. I don't believe in that. I literally don't, which is why I asked the question. So also, additionally, I think that people are afraid to offend someone. I think this is probably the biggest problem with current esports journalism, is that they're afraid that they'll say something that offends the player, and so therefore they will either kind of curtail the actual thing of what they want to say to where now it's just not meaningful at all, or they won't ask it at all. And there is an art to saying something that is like inherently kind of offensive, but you ask it in such a way to where it isn't offensive. And that comes with the skill, but you don't develop that skill unless you're willing to kind of push that line and see exactly, what is the offensive line? Where do people stand, or where do players stand when it comes to being offended? Like that's also your whole point as an interviewer anyways, is that sometimes you do have to ask the hard questions, which then does end up offending sometimes the interviewee. But as you get more experience, you're able to learn exactly where that line is, especially if you've interviewed that particular person quite a bit. Then you understand exactly what the barometer is. Maybe you've read some other interviews that then you could go off of, and as such. So overall, I think the entire press conference debacle and whatnot, and why there are shitty questions, that is the entire reasoning, is that people are afraid to ask said things. Some people have a quota that they need to meet and whatnot, so they just kind of regurgitate regular shit and whatnot. It's legitimately just worse than a one-on-one interview. Like, even things that I would say in a press conference are just worse questions, because as a one-on-one, you can ask things about their team, maybe things of what they think about their team, about their coaching staff, etc. Maybe they might say something negative or whatnot. But, in a press conference, they have to kind of say something positive, because the dude next to them is sitting right fucking there. So you could see how this kind of can all be a delicate situation, and as to why press conferences in general are watered down. But I think what would be cool is if maybe a veteran interviewer could introduce a how-to interview series. I think that would, if you want to help the community out, I think that would be a sick thing to do. I know that Thorne had actually done, I want to say he did two videos about the subject of interviewing and how to interview. And I would highly recommend those, but that'd be kind of cool if there was a 101 how to interview in esports, or 102, etc. I think that would be super sick if you want to help progress the scene and whatnot. But even here as such of what I just said, I think this is it's a decent start. I don't have a whole lot of experience. I don't even know if I'm correct in the shit that I'm saying. I don't get a whole lot of views or whatnot. So maybe I am incorrect in all this shit. But realistically, press conferences are shit. So I wouldn't hold anyone, against asking shitty questions. And so I think fans kind of have to deal with it as such. But that isn't to say that we need to be on the same quality as sports. I don't think we need to go down that path of just asking shitty questions either.